We're back. I have this plant right here behind my desk that just desperately needed to be cleaned. It had some sort of pest or something on it, and every inch of it needed to be wiped down. And it's fairly large, and I was just avoiding it. I was procrastinating, but finally the day came where I had to do it. So I decided to put on this podcast that one of my friends could not stop talking about, and I set to work. It took about 2 episodes to fully clean the plant, but it only took one to know that nothing was ever going to be the same. I realized I was going to have to do something I had not done in a very long time. I was going to have to make a YouTube video because I had to find some way, any way to help the cause. So I made a video introducing the Telepathy Tapes, and I've linked it below. I introduced the overarching premise of the podcast, which is about telepathic communication, primarily in the nonverbal autism community. Although if you look in the comments section of that last video, you will see there are a lot of people out there that want to make it very, very clear that this is not occurring only in the autism community. And they're right, it's not. But it is where the telepathy tapes begin. So it's where I'm going to start also. I will be diving into each episode one at a time. And I'll put all of this into a playlist as I go. So please be sure to like and sub and hit the bell and comment and share and all of those things so that the algorithm picks this up and pushes it out to as many people as possible. Because as I'm probably going to say a lot throughout this series, awareness is the next great step. And it's why I'm just not going to shut up about this, which, hi, by the way, I am Sundown, and this is Logically Free-Spirited, where I talk about all things relating to science and spirituality while remaining grounded yet open-minded. And I'm probably going to be focusing a lot on consciousness. So let's dive into it. In my last video, which go watch it if you haven't yet, but in episode 1, we meet our first 2 key players. The first is our host, Vanderbilt graduated documentarian Kai Dickens, known for her previous work such as Show Her the Money, Fish Out of Water, Soul Survivor, 0 Weeks, and many others, as well as Dr. Diane Hennacy Powell, a Johns Hopkins trained neuropsychiatrist, speaker, author, and researcher who is also on the faculty at Harvard. Both of these women are so extremely impressive, to say the least. And Kai discovered Dr. Powell on another podcast, The Cosmos in You, where she discusses her background and her education, her personal experiences, and her research around telepathy, primarily with the autistic savant community. And I'm going to tell you much more about her. But one thing that I found kind of interesting is that the Cosmos and You podcast actually ended in 2017 after 38 episodes. And Dr. Powell was on episode 37, which the specific one is linked below. What I find interesting about this is that that means that Dr. Powell was the second to last guest before this podcast ceased to exist. And in a way, I guess I think that feels kind of serendipitous. Like it was a close call. Like there was a chance that this episode may have never been made and Kai might not have come into contact with Dr. Powell's research. And none of this would be unfolding the way it is now. Anyway, I listened to several episodes of The Cosmos and You, and they're really good and they're evergreen. So I highly recommend them. But moving on, as the key doctor throughout the telepathy tapes, I think it's important that we learn more about Dr. Powell. And let me tell you, this woman is absolutely fascinating. I could do an entire video just talking about her. I actually got emotional reading her bio and all of the amazing work that she's done. Both of her parents were very accomplished academics, and that's putting it extremely mildly. And she herself was a math prodigy doing algebra by the age of 7. Fast forward, and she did her undergrad at Ohio State University, where she studied neuroscience before neuroscience was an option to be studied, by focusing on neurochemistry and biophysics and neurophysiology. And then she went on to medical school at Johns Hopkins. That's also where she completed her postdoctoral training in medicine, neurology, and psychiatry. Then, after receiving her medical degree, she trained at the Institute of Psychiatry in London, along with Sir Michael Rudder, who was actually knighted for his work in autism. I didn't even know that was a thing. Like, I knew people got knighted, but I didn't know anyone was ever knighted for their work with autism. I mean, that's very cool. And then she joins the faculty at Harvard, and that's where telepathy first kind of enters her periphery. She also goes on to do research at the University of California, San Diego during the Human Genome Project, but we're going to go back to Harvard first. So, in the Cosmos and You podcast, Dr. Powell explains that while teaching neuropsychiatry at Harvard, she was also a consulting psychiatrist for the medical wards, and that would mean she'd be on call anytime a psychiatric evaluation may be needed for a patient. During one of these visits, Dr. Powell encountered a woman who was waiting on test results to determine whether or not she had had a heart attack. This was in the 80s when these kinds of test results could easily take over 24 hours, and she didn't want to wait. She wanted to leave against doctor's orders because she claimed to be psychic, and she said that she knew that her results would come back clean, and that, quite frankly, she was getting freaked out and feeling really uncomfortable in the hospital because she could see all of these ghosts of people who had passed. So naturally, that's why they called Dr. Powell. So Dr. Powell asks her if it would be okay if they just sat down and talked a little bit about what she was experiencing. And in so many words, this woman looks at her and says, "You have this bright white light around you, and I trust you, so I will." She's referring to Dr. Powell's aura. And at that point, Dr. Powell says she's never even heard of auras. So she finds it really interesting, and they sit down and they start to talk. That's when this woman starts talking to Dr. Powell and telling her things about herself that she would have no way of knowing. Things about her husband, about her home life. She knew that Dr. Powell's then husband was a chemist, and she also knew that he was applying for different programs all over the country, and she knew which one he was going to get and where they were going to end up. And she was right. That's kind of how all of this started for Dr. Powell. She also tells another story from when she lived in San Diego about being with friends and just kind of thinking and brainstorming and talking about the idea of visiting the state of Oregon. And a few minutes later, her cell phone rings, and it's one of her autistic psychiatric patients who's having a kind of panic attack, saying that they knew that she was going to be leaving San Diego for good. Mind you, she didn't know this. She was still with friends. She was just thinking about visiting it. She had just thought about visiting it. She had no idea that when she would eventually go, she would fall in love with it and end up moving there. But her patient did. And I know what the comments are going to say. They're going to say it's cognitive bias, that she's just fulfilling what she was told. It's self-fulfilling prophecy, or just something other than a psychic prediction, if you will. And I'm just going to tell you all now that I don't have the energy or the desire to try and convince people that do not want to be convinced. I am doing this whole project for the rest of us. So moving on, Kai learns about all of this and more with Dr. Powell, and she's hooked because, obviously, it's fascinating. So after an introductory phone call, she is sent a hard drive with hours and hours of footage of Dr. Powell's experiments. She reviews everything, and she has a phone call with Kent, the cameraman, who documented all of these experiments. And after he adamantly insists that the scientific method was upheld throughout everything, changing him from a skeptic to a believer, Kai decided it was time to fly to Oregon and meet Dr. Powell in person. Dr. Powell has received emails from families and caretakers all over the world for years. So she goes on to read some excerpts from several of these correspondences with doctors and teachers and therapists and parents who are all saying the same thing. They're all claiming that their autistic child can read their mind. Eventually, she reads an email from Sophia, a young woman in Mexico who is emailing about her cousin Mia, who can read her mother, Mia's mother's, mind. And that's when we meet our first telepath, Mia. We first meet Mia on video call. I believe Mia was around 12 years old at the time. Her family explains that she was diagnosed with autism at 2.5 years old, and she's always been nonverbal. They also go on to explain how they came to believe that Mia was telepathic. Previously, she had always used an acrylic letterboard to kind of point to letters individually, But over the pandemic, when she had to start homeschooling, she got an iPad and she learned to spell using that. This made everything much easier and more convenient for her to communicate. She even uses a daily journal or diary now to keep her thoughts and memories in. But one day she typed out a message on her iPad directly to her mother. I can read your mind. Mia's mother's name is Ileana, and at first she was skeptical, of course. She actually admits to even being a little afraid, but after conducting a few of her own tests, it was undeniable. Mia can read Ileana's mind, which, side note, stay tuned to the end of this video for some information about Mia that I find to be absolutely fascinating that isn't included in the telepathy tapes. But anyway, on the video call, after learning all of this, Dr. Powell goes on to conduct a small experiment just to see for herself using a random number generator. Mia moves to the far side of the room, but still within eyesight of the camera. And Dr. Powell generates a 3-digit number using the number generator. And she then messages that number to Ileana via WhatsApp message. After looking at the 3-digit number, Ileana puts her phone face down, and Mia then crosses back over into the, I guess she never leaves the site, and no one says a word, but she comes back over to her mother, where she then uses her spelling device to correctly type all 3 digits that her mother was seeing. Absolutely stunning. I mean, this is the first time we see this. And the best part about all of this is that Mia's having the time of her life. She is smiling and laughing, and it's so clear that she's really excited to share her ability. And because Mia was having such a great time, and with her willingness only, they did this test repeatedly, and she nailed it. Every test, smiling the entire time. So the next step was clear. They had to meet in person. So Kai rents a house outside of Los Angeles, and she orders everything you could possibly need for telepathy experiments. A very specific blindfold called a mindfold, different cards and props, and large dividers, a new iPad for number generation, and other tests. Kai wants to supply everything herself so that there would be no chance for skeptics to say that Mia's family or Dr. Powell were doing any sort of trickery or cheating on the tests. At the home in Los Angeles, she gathers a crew together and they do everything right. They cover or remove every reflective surface. There are 5 cameras and 5 microphones, and every inch of the room is covered, both audibly and visually. Again, attempting to leave no room for skeptics to argue. And I don't say this to mean that skeptics aren't welcome in the conversation. Of course they are. It's a vital part of discovery. We need all sides. But rather I say it to stress and express how sincere and seriously Kai and the crew and the families are taking these tests and these experiments. This is not a joke, not to these people, not to them, not to these families. Which, by the way, you can find many of Mia's experiments that I'm about to talk about, as well as many others that we'll get to as the series progresses on the website, the telepathytapes.com. I mentioned this in my last video, but Kai is currently raising money to turn all of this into a documentary. So they've uploaded around 25 videos onto the website behind a $10 paywall to help raise funds for the documentary. And I put links to the website, the fundraiser, and everything in the description box. But I digress. It's time to start the in-person experiments. The first experiment they do is, again, with a random number generator. This time, they are using the new iPad that Kai purchased. They've downloaded a new number generator, and they've set it to 3-digit numbers, again, between 100 and 999. And Dr. Powell hits the generator 3 times to make sure it's extra scrambled. And we're good to go. Someone on the production team comes in and they bring this large black divider out and they place it between Mia and her mother, Ileana. Once it's in place, Dr. Powell turns the iPad around and shows Ileana the 3-digit numbers, and then she turns it back around and puts it down. They then remove the divider separating Mia and Ileana and Dr. Powell, and Ileana picks up the letter board so that Mia can point, and Mia points at the numbers one at a time, again, getting it exactly right. However, one thing that I want to make sure to note, which is actually discussed in the video call with Mia's family, is that Mia also has synesthesia, which, if you aren't familiar, synesthesia is when one sense is experienced through another sense. For example, tasting words or seeing music. It's estimated that between 1 and 4% of the population have this ability, and women are more likely to experience it than men. And it also tends to decrease with age. In Mia's case, she sees colors while visualizing numbers and letters, which means she doesn't actually always look at the letterboard when she's spelling because she can sense the colors, I don't know, through her hands in the ether. I don't exactly know how to explain it or even exactly how it works, but when you watch the experiment on the website, it's clear there is zero chance that Mia can see the numbers that Dr. Powell is generating. I mean, again, there's that large black partition in between them, but she's not even paying attention. When Dr. Powell is showing Ileana the number, Mia's looking at and playing with her hands and looking off in another direction. And when they remove the partition, she's still not really paying attention or looking at them. She just kind of points while looking in the other way. I guess sensing the colors, maybe they're reflecting off the walls. I don't know, but she's getting it correct without seeing the numbers and without even seeing the acrylic letterboard. It's fascinating, and it is so worth a watch. Editing sundown here. Watching that back, I want to clarify that paying attention was not the right terminology there. She very well may have been paying attention in her own way. I was going off of body language, and I know better than that, especially when it comes to people with autism that struggle with different motor functions and movements. So that was not the right language there, but I hope that my intention is understood and sincere, like sincerely. I'm being sincere in my intention, and I wanted to clarify that paying attention wasn't the right terminology there, but I hope that you understand what I mean. That I am just trying to say that she couldn't see the fucking numbers. They do this exact same test repeatedly, about 20 times, ensuring the entire time that Mia is comfortable and happy and sincerely wants to participate. One thing that is extremely clear when listening to the telepathy tapes is that the safety and the happiness and the comfortability of these children and their families involved is just the absolute most paramount part of everything they do. I actually contacted Kai before moving forward with this series because I wanted to make sure that I was contributing in a meaningful way and definitely not taking away from the cause. And the only thing that she wanted to stress was the safety of these families and the protection of these kids. It's really important that I make that extremely clear. So after several of these tests, all 100% accurate, they move on to a different kind of experiment. And this one involves colored popsicle sticks. Mia is blindfolded, again with the Mindfold, that special blindfold. And several people, before trying any of these experiments, actually had tried that on to make sure that you couldn't see through it, and you can't. I mean, I'll put a picture up. Look at this thing. It's impossible. Hi again. I just learned something interesting that I wanted to add in here. When I was researching the Mindfold, I learned that they were actually originally designed and created for psychedelic therapy, specifically psilocybin therapy. Just thought that was interesting. So Mia is blindfolded, and she's handed these popsicle sticks. It's a nail file, but you get it. She's handed these popsicle sticks one at a time, and she sorts them into piles correctly by color. Do you understand what I'm saying? She is blindfolded, right? She can't see. And yet she's sensing these colors, I don't know, through her hands, through Ileana's mind. I have no idea, some way other than visually. And she's sorting them correctly. And all of this is on the videos on the website. And they go into everything in more detail in the podcast. That's why I don't want you to just take my word for it. I need you to go listen to this podcast and go watch these tapes. And everything is linked below. So now it's time to do the last experiment of day one. And Kai had brought a book from home. and they did several tests where Mia could not see the book, but she could correctly tell everyone what page number Ileana was on, or what word on the page she was reading, or what picture she was looking at. Again, 100%. And everyone is just shocked because this is just so cool. And you can tell that the family and Mia are just excited to be listened to. They're excited that someone's taking interest. A lot of the families throughout this series explain that they just want to understand what's happening. There are things that can be really difficult. On the lighter end, they can't hide birthday presents or sweets. But on the heavier end, there's no space for private thoughts or tough emotions. It's a very, very complicated scenario, which is why they want help and understandably answers. Towards the end of the day, while trying to reconcile with what she just witnessed, Kai asks if Mia can see through her mother's eyes. And Mia responds, "No, I can see everywhere." On day 2, things actually get a little more sciencey when we meet Dr. Jeff Tarrant. Now, I looked into him and looked all of this up, so you don't have to. But Dr. Tarrant is based out of Eugene, Oregon, and he is a licensed psychologist and board-certified neurofeedback specialist. He is also the founder and the director of the Neuromeditation Institute and the chief science officer at Helium, both of which are organizations that focus on neurology and meditation. And he has been working with QEEGs for the better part of 25 years. Now, QEEG stands for Quantified Electroencephalogram, which is a non-invasive brain scan that measures the electrical activities in the brainwaves. And on day 2, Dr. Tarrant did one of these QEEGs between Mia and Ileana while they did a few telepathy experiments. He said that the overall biggest finding he found was an increase of activation across all of the brainwaves in both of them during the experiments. And he added that while he was surprised, he actually would have been more skeptical if there was no change. Unfortunately, they don't get as deep into the results of the QEEG as I would have liked, but I do think that's for 2 reasons. One, they have a documentary that they're working on, right? And they can't give everything away. But 2, this is not the only QEEG that we will encounter that is done by Dr. Tarrant. And the episodes get more and more sciencey as the series continues. There are also a few other things that occurred over the 2 days of testing with Mia that I want to make sure to point out. One is that, at least for the sake of the experiments, it seems as though Mia is only telepathic with her mother. When at the home in Los Angeles, they actually tried a few experiments with Mia's father, and she wasn't able to read his mind. I find this particularly interesting because we are also told that Mia wrote in her journal, which she shared, that she can actually read anyone's mind. You just have to believe in her. Which, if that's true, while sad, it could mean that Mia doesn't believe that her father believes in her ability. It could also mean that Mia could potentially read Dr. Powell's mind. And I guess I wish they would have tried some of these telepathy experiments with someone else who is a believer that isn't Ileana. And who knows, maybe they did and it just didn't make the cut of the podcast, or maybe they didn't find out about it until after everyone left Los Angeles, or maybe they just didn't want to confuse things. I have no idea, but I still thought it was worth pointing out. I also want to add that Mia considers this a gift. She says that she prefers telepathy over any other form of communication. And I said this in my last video, but it makes perfect sense to me. I've always felt that as humans, part of our suffering is the result of miscommunication. I'm an optimist, and I like to think that everyone has better intentions than we assume, and that this disconnect occurs when those intentions are either miscommunicated or misunderstood or both. So the idea of telepathy, where things like tone and context don't apply, just the intended message is delivered, seems like the clearest, most concise form of communication imaginable. I also want to add that the CDC estimates that around 1% of the world's population is autistic. That's around 75 million people. And it's estimated that between 20 and 30% of those people are nonverbal. And I can only imagine how many of those people never learned to spell and therefore are never understood. That's why when Kai shares a message directly from Mia, it impacted me so much. Just hearing words that came from her, words that many people try to invalidate, just struck me to my core. And it's why I'm doing this. I just keep thinking of the thousands and thousands of people that are going unheard right now. Okay, something else I want to talk about is that before meeting in person, Kai sent Mia a list of questions to get to know her. And one of the things that Mia said that I want to take a moment to unpack is that she doesn't like wearing earrings or dresses. And while at first that doesn't seem worth expanding on, I find it very, very interesting. So if you are still here, I am trusting that you are really into this and you're open-minded. So please bear with me. But this is not in the telepathy tapes. In another interview with Kai, which if I can find it, I will link it below. It's when I was devouring everything I could get my hands on, and I didn't know I was going to be taking on this project and needed to start keeping track. But anyways, in this other interview, Kai goes on to explain that one thing that she's come to believe after working with all of these people is that reincarnation is 100% true and real. And she reveals that one of the people that helped convince her of this is, in fact, Mia. I believe all of this occurred after they finished recording the first season of the podcast. But Kai learned that while Mia usually does well in public places and around large crowds, which, for instance, she loves going to the mall, she would get really, really upset every time they went to a large family gathering. And once she learned to spell, her family finally asked her why this was. And she said, it's because you put me in earrings and dresses. I mean, apparently they don't do that for the mall, but they do for these family functions. And she hates it. But then she goes on to add that in her past life, she was a male carpenter and that there is very much a part of him still within her. And that part simply hates wearing these earrings and dresses. Is that not crazy? I think that's so cool and I wanted to share. But it's what's actually in the podcast that changed everything for me. If you listen to episode 1, or if you've already done it, you'll hear Mia's entire message, but there's a portion of it that I really want to share. And this is what Mia had to say. Imagine not being able to talk. Sometimes it hurts like hell. Autistic people can do anything. It's a lie that we can't. We find it more difficult, but we can. It would be possible if they believed in us more. No one knows what life is worth, but don't tell me it doesn't matter. Reading all of that, all I can think about is some of the disparaging comments on my last video, calling this nonsense and ridiculous and pseudoscience. And now it feels like a personal attack against these people, against people like Mia directly, who are clearly telling the world that we've got it wrong. And I understand that materialism has reigned supreme for centuries, but the time has come for those who are closed-minded to step aside. The rest of us are done listening to you, and we want to hear from them now. And we're going to. In the next episode, we'll meet the remarkable Akil and his mom, Manisha, as well as the crowd favorites, Houston and Katie. And that video will be out much sooner, I promise. I'm getting the hang of all of this. I was waiting for a mic that actually sucked, and then I was waiting for the light, and now I give up. But I love you guys. Please be cool to each other in the comments, and I will see you very soon, okay? Oh, stop. Let me start again.